Imagine the darkest hour of the night. A classified safe house, sitting completely off the grid. A silent perimeter breach. Two elite tactical teams, converging on the exact same coordinate. They move like phantoms through the shadows. Heavy boots, crushing the dry grass. Suppressed rifles raised, flashbangs primed. The door is breached with a deafening explosion of splintered wood and twisted metal. But as the smoke clears, the ultimate nightmare unfolds. The agents storming the room do not find a cartel sicario waiting for them. Instead, the laser sights of an FBI tactical unit illuminate the ballistic vests of a Drug Enforcement Administration strike team. Nobody lowers their weapon. Fingers tighten on the triggers. Sweat drips down the faces of the most highly trained operatives in the United States. A single flinch, a single misunderstood shadow, will ignite the deadliest friendly fire massacre in the history of American law. Enforcement. They were sent to hunt the devil. But the devil was not holding a gun. He was sitting quietly in the corner of the room, smiling. He was a phantom who had manipulated the two most powerful intelligence agencies in the world into hunting each other. Welcome to Shadow Dossier. Today, we declassify the most humiliating, terrifying, and deeply buried secret in the history of the war on drugs. To understand how the United States government was tricked into a suicidal standoff, we must first understand the mind of the architect. In the clandestine world of intelligence, an informant is usually a desperate criminal caught in a trap. They are low-level thugs, cornered rats, singing to the police to save their own skin from a lengthy prison sentence. But the man we will call the asset was something entirely different. He was not a rat. He was a chess grandmaster playing on a board that the authorities did not even know existed. He did not come to the FBI in handcuffs. He walked through the front doors of the federal building in a tailored suit, projecting the absolute confidence of a man who owned the city. He possessed the psychological profile of a clinical sociopath, masked behind a charismatic and utterly convincing facade. He offered the Bureau a golden ticket, a direct, unfiltered view into the inner workings of a billion-dollar Mexican cartel. He promised them the names of the bosses, the locations of the stash houses, and the exact routes of the smuggling corridors. To the ambitious agents sitting across the interrogation table, this was the holy grail of law enforcement. The war on drugs was a political meat grinder, and the agency desperately needed a massive headline-grabbing victory to justify their budget to the bureaucrats in Washington. This was the career-defining case that would guarantee promotions and secure massive funding, but they were blinded by their own ambition. They failed to realize that the devil does not offer a deal without a hidden price. The FBI eagerly initiated the protocol. They brought him into the fold. They assigned him handlers. They gave him a code name, a secure line, and absolute operational immunity. In their minds, they had just recruited the ultimate weapon against the cartel. In reality, they had just invited a Trojan horse into the very heart of the federal government. The asset began to deliver almost immediately. He fed them precise, highly actionable intelligence. Federal agents raided warehouses, intercepted massive shipments of cocaine hidden in commercial trucks, and paraded low-level cartel lieutenants in front of the flashing cameras of the media. The FBI celebrated their unprecedented success. They believed they were systematically dismantling a vast and complex criminal empire, piece by carefully targeted piece. But let us look closer at the shadows creeping. Beneath the surface of these victories, every single piece of information, every midnight raid, every high-profile arrest was meticulously curated by the asset. He was not destroying the cartel at all. He was using the immense power, the limitless resources, and the tactical superiority of the United States government to systematically eliminate his own personal rivals in the underworld. If a competing smuggler undercut his prices, the FBI miraculously received an anonymous tip about their next major shipment. If a ruthless sicario threatened his expanding territory, an elite federal strike team would kick down their door before sunrise. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had unwittingly become the heavily armed, taxpayer-funded hit squad for a rising cartel kingpin. The asset was completely untouchable. He moved through the violent underworld with absolute impunity, shielded by the invisible and impenetrable armor of federal protection. His handlers dismissed the growing red flags as occupational hazards. They ignored the whispers from the desperate streets that their star witness was amassing unprecedented wealth and tyrannical power. The bureaucratic ego of the Bureau simply could not process the terrifying possibility that highly trained federal agents were being played by a street criminal. They protected him fiercely. They hid his existence from local police departments, from border patrol agencies, and most importantly, they hid him from the Drug Enforcement Administration. The FBI firmly believed they controlled the board and held all the winning cards. But while they were busy polishing their commendation medals and drafting triumphant press releases, the asset was quietly preparing his masterpiece. He had realized early on that manipulating one federal agency was incredibly profitable and dangerously easy. But manipulating two heavily armed and fiercely competitive agencies at the exact same time, that was the path to absolute, undisputed supremacy in the criminal underworld. The trap was perfectly set. The blindfold was securely tied over the eyes of the FBI, and in the dark, paranoid corridors of their rival agency, the next phase of the most brilliant and devastating deception in criminal history was about to begin. The asset was about to introduce himself to the DEA, and he was bringing a war with him. Across the sprawling, sun-baked asphalt of the southern border, another war was being waged in the shadows. The Drug Enforcement Administration was bleeding. They were losing ground to a phantom. A brutal, highly sophisticated new kingpin was rapidly consolidating power, swallowing up rival territories with terrifying efficiency, and flooding the streets with unprecedented quantities of narcotics. The DEA task force was desperate. They were tracking ghosts, chasing dead leads, and hitting empty warehouses. The sheer volume of product crossing the border suggested a mastermind, operating with military precision and seemingly limitless resources. And then, a miracle walked through the door. A highly connected, anonymous informant reached out to the DEA with a staggering proposition. He offered them the keys to the kingdom. He provided granular, actionable intelligence on the movements of this rising kingpin. He gave them the exact coordinates of multi-million-dollar stash houses, the encrypted radio frequencies used by the smuggling convoys, and the identities of corrupt border officials. To the exhausted, frustrated agents of the DEA, this mysterious source was a godsend. They immediately placed him on the payroll. They assigned him handlers, a covert budget, and a heavily guarded operational profile. They believed they had finally found the silver bullet to pierce the armor of the new cartel. But they were looking at a mirror and seeing a savior. The horrific, unthinkable reality was that the brilliant informant guiding the DEA was the exact same man feeding intelligence to the FBI. the asset was playing both sides of the federal chessboard. He was simultaneously the FBI's most protected asset and the DEA's most valuable spy. And the rising, untraceable kingpin that the DEA was desperately hunting, that was him. He was using the DEA to eliminate the last remaining obstacles in his path, utilizing their heavily armed strike teams to wipe out the final pockets of resistance to his total market dominance. How could this happen? How could two of the most heavily funded, technologically advanced intelligence agencies on the planet be completely blind to a deception of this magnitude? The answer lies in the dark, paranoid heart of the American bureaucratic machine. It is a fatal flaw known as the Intelligence Firewall. The FBI and the DEA do not share their toys. They operate in deeply entrenched silos, driven by a toxic culture of interagency rivalry, budget competitions, and massive bureaucratic egos. Information is power, and neither agency was willing to surrender their ultimate weapon to a rival department. The FBI fiercely guarded the true identity of the asset behind layers of classified clearances and heavily redacted files. The DEA, equally paranoid and protective, buried their star informant in ghost protocols and undocumented cash payments. They built impenetrable walls of secrecy around the exact same man. They created a perfectly insulated void, a catastrophic blind spot in the intelligence grid. And within that void, the asset thrived. He masterfully manipulated the deeply ingrained mistrust between the two agencies. If the FBI got too close to his personal smuggling routes, he would feed the DEA a massive bust to distract the federal heat. If the DEA started asking uncomfortable questions about his sudden accumulation of wealth, he would deliver a rival boss to the FBI to solidify his immunity. He was conducting a lethal symphony of deception, and the United States government was blindly playing the instruments. He turned the fragmented territorial nature of federal law enforcement into his greatest operational advantage. But a system built on total deception is inherently unstable. The lies were becoming too massive, the operations too complex, and the stakes too incredibly high. The gravitational pull of this massive cover-up was inevitably drawing the two blind giants toward a catastrophic collision. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday evening. The DEA received a frantic, highly classified tip from their star informant. He claimed he had finally pinpointed the exact current location of the elusive kingpin they had been hunting for months. He gave them the address of an isolated, heavily fortified safe house on the outskirts of the city. He warned them that the target was heavily armed, surrounded by elite sicarios, and preparing to flee the country before dawn. This was the moment. The DEA mobilized their most elite, heavily armed tactical strike team. They authorized a no-knock, overwhelming force raid. At the exact same moment, across the city, the red phone rang in the secure FBI command center. It was the asset. His voice was laced with manufactured panic. He claimed his cover was blown. He told his FBI handlers that a rival cartel hit squad had tracked him to his safe house and was moving in for an immediate assassination. He demanded an emergency extraction protocol. The FBI, terrified of losing their most valuable intelligence source, triggered a massive, heavily armed hostage rescue response. They scrambled their elite SWAT units, authorized lethal force, and dispatched heavily armored vehicles into the night. Two separate command centers, operating in total, arrogant isolation, had just ordered their most heavily armed operators to converge on the exact same coordinate. They were both responding to the exact same man. They were both fully authorized to kill anyone standing in their way. The fuse was lit. The countdown to a national tragedy had begun. The vehicles sped through the empty streets, their sirens silenced, running entirely on dark mode. The agents inside checked their weapons, chambered their rounds, and prepared for a brutal, close-quarters firefight with ruthless cartel killers. The night air was thick with tension, smelling of diesel exhaust and adrenaline. They were hurtling toward a violent reckoning, completely unaware that the enemies waiting for them in the darkness were wearing the exact same flag on their shoulders. The collision was no longer a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. The vehicles cut their engines a block away from the designated coordinate. The neighborhood was dead silent. A thick curtain of darkness wrapped around the isolated safe house. Sitting at the end of a broken dirt road, from the north, the heavily armored tactical team of the Drug Enforcement Administration moved into position. They were hunting a ghost, a ruthless kingpin they believed was heavily guarded and heavily armed. From the south, moving with identical precision and lethal intent, the elite hostage rescue team of the Federal Bureau of Investigation tightened their perimeter. They were coming to save their most prized possession, completely convinced that a cartel-hit squad was already inside the structure, preparing for an execution. Two apex predators, bred by the exact same government, stalking the exact same prey in the total darkness. Neither team knew the other was there. The radios in both command centers remained entirely silent. The Intelligence Firewall had done its job perfectly. It had engineered a perfect storm of lethal confusion. At exactly 0200 hours, the signal was given. The breach was chaotic, violent, and utterly deafening. The heavy steel ram of the FBI team smashed through the reinforced front door, sending a shockwave of splintered wood flying into the hallway. Milliseconds later, the back door of the safe house exploded inward under the force of a DEA explosive charge. Flashbang grenades sailed through the shattered windows, detonating with blinding flashes of white light and concussive roars that sucked the oxygen from the air. The house instantly transformed into a chaotic nightmare of swirling smoke, screaming voices, and sweeping red laser sights. Men wearing heavy ballistic armor poured into the confined spaces, their assault rifles raised, their adrenaline spiking to lethal levels. They swept through the living room, clearing the corners, hunting for the enemy. But as the blinding smoke began to settle, the horrifying reality of the situation crashed down upon them. Through the thick haze of the flashbangs, an FBI tactical operator found himself staring down the barrel of an M4 carbine. But the man holding the weapon was not a Mexican cartel sicario. He was an American federal agent. The stark white letters DEA were clearly emblazoned across his black tactical vest. At the exact same moment, the DEA operator realized that the red dot of a laser sight was resting perfectly on the center of his chest, originating from the rifle of an FBI SWAT agent. The shouting intensified into a frantic, panicked crescendo. "Federal agent, drop your weapon, stand down!" Nobody lowered their gun. Nobody stepped back. The training kicked in, but the training was designed for fighting enemies, not allies. The situation was entirely unprecedented. In the claustrophobic confines of the safe house, dozens of the most highly trained shooters in the country were locked in a Mexican standoff, their fingers trembling on the triggers of fully automatic weapons. The tension was thick enough to choke on. The air was electrified with the terrifying realization that a single accidental discharge, a single misunderstood twitch, would instantly trigger a bloodbath. It would be a massacre. of federal agents slaughtering federal agents in the dark. And right there, sitting calmly in a cheap leather armchair in the absolute center of the room, was the architect of this incredible madness. The asset was not hiding. He was not cowering in fear. He was simply sitting there, his hands resting comfortably in his lap, watching the two most terrifying law enforcement agencies on the planet point their guns at each other's heads. He did not say a word. He did not have to. His silence was the loudest, most arrogant statement imaginable. He had successfully weaponized the United States government against itself. He had turned the vaunted American intelligence apparatus into his own personal security detail and his own private assassination squad. He had built an empire of blood and cocaine by simply feeding the bureaucratic egos of the men sworn to stop him. The standoff dragged on for agonizing minutes. The standoff only ended when the frantic radio calls finally reached the highest echelons of Washington, D.C. Directors were woken from their sleep. Frantic, top-secret phone calls were placed between furiously competing agencies. The order to stand down finally echoed through the earpieces of the operators standing in the smoke-filled living room. Slowly, reluctantly, with an overwhelming sense of confusion and profound disgust, the weapons were lowered. The disaster had been averted by a fraction of an inch. But the true horror of the night was not the bullets that were almost fired. The true horror was what happened next. You might think that after discovering they had been completely manipulated, outsmarted, and nearly forced into slaughtering each other, the federal government would destroy the asset. You might think he would be locked away in a dark federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. But you would be wrong. This is the shadow world. And in the shadow world, truth is always the first casualty. Exposing the asset meant exposing the monumental, humiliating failure of the FBI and the DEA. It meant admitting to the American public that millions of taxpayer dollars had been used to fund a cartel kingpin. It meant congressional hearings, destroyed careers, and a catastrophic loss of public trust. The government could not afford the truth, so they did what they always do. They buried it. They classified the files. They redacted the reports. They swore the tactical operators to absolute, lifelong secrecy under the threat of federal prosecution. And what happened to the puppet master? What happened to the man who nearly caused a civil war between federal agencies? He was quietly relocated. He was given a new identity, a new life, and total immunity from prosecution. The federal government protected the monster because the monster knew entirely too much about their own incompetence. The system did not break that night. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work. It protected itself at all costs. The war on drugs is not a war of good against evil. It is a complex, terrifying game of leverage, manipulation, and classified cover-ups. Who truly holds the power when the line between the cartel and the government is completely erased by a single informant? This is the reality they desperately want you to ignore, but we will not look away. We will continue to pull the files from the fire. We will continue to expose the lies hidden behind the redacted black ink. If you want to know what else your government is hiding in the shadows, hit that subscribe button right now. The truth is out there, and Shadow Dossier will bring it to the light. Do not trust the official narrative. We will see you in the next classified file.